Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the authors and editors discuss news and events with a splash of history. Our host today is Dan Masterson. Joining him is Jim Dunnigan, well-known military author and the Dean of Wargaming. Also, joining today's show is columnist and author retired Colonel Austin Bay.
Welcome, gentlemen. Austin. China hangs as a sword over the top of the necks of South Korea and Japan, and has for centuries. Jim, what do those two countries need to do to deter China from having them in their sights?
Well, maintain their alliance with the United States and the other, members of the Western Pacific, alliance against China. That includes Australia and a number of, Malaysia, a number of other countries in Southeast Asia. They're all opposed being, how should I put it, overtaken by China. The Philippines is actively engaged in fighting China. There have been several actions recently, in the South China Sea, where the Chinese were attempting to stop the Filipinos from reinforcing a garrison of Marines they have on a beach, LST, which has been there for, 15 years or so. The Filipinos tried to parachute in supplies, and the Chinese had speedboats out there trying to get to them and grab them before the Filipinos could. Supplies eventually got through, but China displayed, using a number of warships, well, Coast Guard ships, but their Coast Guard ships are armed and dangerous, that they are determined to basically keep everybody out of the South China Sea. The world cannot allow that to happen. More than half of the world's trade travels through the South China Sea, and China has no friends, as it were. Now, China can pretend it doesn't need any friends, but it does. Another problem China has is there's a new northern sea route, which goes from, and it's mostly ice-free, and there are several nations, including China, which have built icebreakers. That's a first for China. They're not really an Arctic country, but they see that northern sea route, which goes from East Asia to northern Europe. And it's becoming a more and more important route because it saves several weeks off the transit time of ships going from East Asia to Europe. This has been in the works, so to speak, for years, but now the Northern Sea Route is actually functional, and that's going to change things. And you got to remember, China cannot afford to get into a war. People forget that. They say, well, China's mighty, China can do this, China can do that. China has to maintain open sea lanes for trade to get their goods out and to get needed goods in. China cannot feed itself. It depends on imported food in order to survive. So China can, shout and pout and threaten, but they really can't do much. They are the ones that are dependent upon, open sea routes. And so if they close them, they're basically cutting off their own food supply. And that often gets lost in the argument. That if they get shut down, they even lose access to the Northern Sea Route, which is a magnificent new, route that China can take advantage of as long as they're not at war with the rest of the world.
Austin, how do you see the specter of China and how it's affecting Japan and Korea?
Well, let me make a comment about the Northern Sea Route. The Chinese have been very interested in it. As a matter of fact, I don't know what the situation is right now, but they were interested at one time in building a port, improving a port in Norway, one that they would control at the European end of that sea route. And this isn't news. That's one of their Belt and Road initiatives, and that was one of the maritime roads that they talked about. So Jim's right; they're interested in using that route. But as a matter of fact, they call themselves an Arctic nation. They have said that, and you can read that as I did this in something I wrote a few years ago, saying, look, is that a new claim on Siberia? Well, the Chinese have claimed Siberia forever, and they claim with good historical argument that the Tsar stole Siberia from the Chinese Empire. We can let the Russians and Chinese parry over that. No, here's what I'm interested in, and you can call it a second tier concern, because as Jim described it, the China's economic interests deter its military action, and yet that you can make the same argument for Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine. And now let's start with that one there. What did Ukraine do in 1994? Budapest Accords. They gave up their nuclear weapons. Would Russia have even invaded, or Putin's Russia, invaded in 2014 to annex Crimea if Ukraine had nuclear weapons? Fair question to ask. Can't roll back history. But there's denuclearization led to conventional war. Then the expansion that took place of that war in 2022, when I think this is going to be the historical read on it, he saw weak will in the United States, weakness in the United States, weakness in quote-unquote NATO alliance, even though Ukraine's not a member of NATO, aspires to be a member of NATO. And that there was an opportunity, and the kickoff on that is the Afghanistan debacle. So would he have acted in 2014? Would he have acted in 2022 if Ukraine had nuclear weapons? Don't think Japan and South Korea don't consider that angle, Dan. They do. And this is something that's not new to Strategy Page at all. I was thinking, when did Jim and I first discuss on a podcast? It may not have been a strategy talk, but have been one that PJ Media was doing, or Glenn Reynolds, and the like. But Iran getting a nuclear weapon, but we also, how long would it take South Korea and Japan? And the joke was it might take a couple of weeks for the Japanese and the like, even though there are sly suggestions they could assemble one in 2 to 3 days. And unlike North Korea, which has nuclear weapons, but they're dirty and we're not sure whether they're going to go off or not. South Korea and Japan are absolutely high-tech, and their weapons would work. And the weapons would be deter North Korea or deter China. And this goes back to how reliable is the United States as an ally. And Jim's first answer to you was, what does South Korea and Japan need to do? Stay allied with the United States. Amen. That is correct. But in the look back at what went with Ukraine, vis-a-vis, that crops up in considerations. And there have been a couple of articles I read, I want to say in the last 18 months, about South Korea and nuclear aspirations. Plus, the fact is that Jim recently wrote something about the fact about a change in, historical generational change in Japan. We've seen Japan move from quote-unquote strictly defensive weapons with self-defense forces to offensive capability and strike capability. And we've seen South Korea and Japan, despite their historical enmity, work together on strike capability to deal with North Korea's threats. And so back to the nuclear issue, there are so many arguments against South Korea and Japan doing it, and one of them is the United States is backing you up. But then again, that goes in, how reliable do you see the United States? Would it deter China if Japan had a nuclear weapon? Or would it provoke China? I think China is, as Jim says, to a large degree self-deterring. But Xi Jinping also talks this aggressive nationalism. And we've seen what they do to the Philippines. The Philippines is pushing back. But 2016, the UN Arbitration Court in The Hague, on the UNCLOS UN conventional law of the sea. Philippines filed, I think it was in 2013, a complaint about China stealing resources and intruding on their EEZ, exclusive economic zone. And in 2016, the Hague ruled 98% in favor of the Philippines, and China's ignored it. Just ignored it. I mean, utterly lawless, and it continued to not only claim the 9-dash line, which drops all the way from the Chinese coast almost down to Singapore, but they've come up with a 10-dash line now, and the dash is behind Taiwan, saying that this is sovereign Chinese maritime zone. Pushback from the Philippines. Last week, I believe it was, Vietnam applied to the UN to do something that they can do legally under UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, saying that their EEZ went out to the end of the continental shelf. And that's lawfare, legal response to China's claims that it controls all that, and it even sends drilling rigs into Vietnamese waters. They haven't done that recently, but they did in 2014, and they still make the claim that all the natural gas and potential oil reserves in Vietnamese waters really belong to China. And what's the domestic payoff for the Communist Chinese Party? We're standing strong for China, and we're also righting all the historical wrongs, what they claim that have been against China for the last 200 years, the end of the Chinese Empire and the Europeans and the other enemies on the periphery. But would a nuclear weapon deter China? Would it be useful to Japan and South Korea? There are Japanese and South Koreans that think it is, and it is something that gets extremely complicated given the long historical enmity between China and Japan. But South Korea sits right there, right on the border of North Korea, which is a nuclear power. And it's been a considered response by the South Koreans for at least 2 decades.
Yeah, and the South Koreans are running out of patience. The North Koreans' posture, they're right up on the DMZ now. They hear all kinds of noise. They're floating balloons down into South Korea full of garbage. There's garbage balloon war. That was because the South Koreans, usually these are people who got out of North Korea and now living in South Korea. They would send balloons when the winds were going in the right direction into North Korea, carrying consumer goods, some money. A dollar is still a very valuable commodity in North Korea, even though it's illegal to have one. But if you got one, you got real money, not the crap that the North Korean government issues. So the North Koreans are on the defensive. They pretend to be in charge and willing to attack and what have you. But the Chinese act the same way. The Chinese, are trying to huff and puff and scare everybody. But anybody who sits down and looks at China's situation historically, and it actually is now, sees that China is in a bad situation. They have internal problems. The economy is basically, on the downward swing. They still haven't digested all those real estate debacles they tolerated for years, and then they blew up, mainly because of malfeasance and lying by provincial officials looking to make themselves look rich and be rich. Some of those crooked provincial officials have since been prosecuted and sent to jail. But the Chinese are now in fear of losing their access to food imports. And as I pointed out earlier, they cannot feed themselves. So they can huff and puff and make scary faces and scary noises. But if they make a move that basically generates a pushback from the United States, Japan, South Korea, the United States, South Korea, and Japan and Taiwan are all tight allies. Right? You can spin that down to Singapore. Singapore knows whose side they're on. So the Chinese basically are blocked So, like I say, they can make noises, they can make dirty faces and scary faces, but they can't really do anything because they are the ones who are on the defensive. And so far, nobody in China. Well, Xi Jinping is in political trouble now. He's basically made himself president for life. That's not supposed to be that way. Until 10 years ago, they basically selected a new leader among the senior leadership, and that fellow served for 5 years, and then a new one came in. Well, Xi Jinping broke that thing, and now he's been in office for 10 years, and the Chinese see that violation of the understanding as one of the reasons why the Chinese economy is going into the toilet. Now, I don't know if that's actually happening. I mean, China was having problems with or without, Xi Jinping's, internal political shenanigans. But since he's so, how should I put it, distracted by his own machinations, he's not really taking care of business. And business is bad right now. And unless business improves in China, it's only going to get worse.
But there's another read on this too, though, and it's a dire one, which is window of opportunity for the Chinese Communist Party to achieve some of the territorial goals. Xi Jinping and even he's preached about this. They're essentially the recovery of what he considers to be the essential Chinese empire, and that includes Taiwan. They've had a huge military buildup. Now, questionable how effective some of their weapons are, but in size, their navy is quite large, and it is they have that an edge in the immediate area in their quote unquote. If they were going to fight a home game, it's their coastline, their littoral. But also the U.S. and its allies, and that includes Japan and South Korea, are coming in with a new generation of hypersonic, long-range strike conventional missiles that could suppress, knock out all the Chinese shore batteries. And then we've talked about this on Strategy Talk about how you drop sea mines and the like, and tie the Chinese, not just the Chinese Navy, but all the China's commercial ships are either kept away from the coast or they're bottled up in their harbors. But you also have to have the political will to go with the military capability to pull that off. And there is a window of opportunity that has been talked about. The various, I think it was Admiral Davidson that had talked about the window, but it precedes that. Andy Marshall used to talk about China having a window of opportunity in the 2020s, and that's news from 1992 and 1993. Thinking ahead 3 decades, and there is a window of opportunity in there that, especially if things are going to hell on the domestic front, it becomes for a dictator facing these kinds of domestic threats to launch an offensive. Think of Galtieri in 1982 in Argentina as a tin pot example of it. China's not a tin pot. And Galtieri was very full of himself in a way that the Chinese leaders are not. Nevertheless, they feel the pressure, and there's an example of a dictatorship moving and starting a war that they lost, which is something that the Chinese would have to consider. And there's another analog there too. It's taking a island and fighting what is a sea power. And Britain, still, it's small, but it's a sea power that far outclassed Argentina. China has a huge local, or let's say Western Pacific, certainly first island chain, moving to the second island chain, sea power. Now, how do you deter it? Well, Jim says it's self-deterring. Nuclear weapons, the U.S. has them. Japan and South Korea, it crops up. It's buried deep, often in the defense literature, crops up every once in a while at colloquies and seminars. But it is discussed, and as Jim and I both pointed out, and several dozen other military and intelligence analysts, Japan has gone through a generational change. They understand they need, Jim was writing this the other day, they understand they need power to run their economy, and they're not against nukes. Well, they also, everybody's seen what happened to Germany when Germany decided they were going to shut down their nuclear reactors. Well, that was a mistake. France didn't do it, and they know they're dependent on that. Well, there's a difference between nuclear for generating electricity and economic, but the anathema that Japan once had for all things nuclear has changed. And the South Koreans have thought about building small tactical nukes. And it's something that's out there. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but you do see the deterrence factor. And when you're living that close to a threat like North Korea and China, it becomes something to consider.
Another problem that China has is a Ukrainian development, the USV, the unmanned surface vessel armed with explosives. They use this to destroy the Black Sea Fleet and drive it far to the east with the Sea of Azov, I believe. But now the Ukrainians are sending their USVs up and attacking the Russians in their refuge forts. The Russians say, oh, no, they're not doing anything. But there have been several major explosions in these ports. I mean, you can't hide big explosions and lots of fires. You can spot them from space, which, satellites have. And there's commercial satellites. Satellite photos are no longer top secret. That's gone for years. And you see satellite photos of all these explosions going on in Novosibirsk and other Russian ports. They're not getting away with anything. And those USVs, which I believe the Taiwanese have shown a great interest in, they can defeat any Chinese attack. Because what you do is you send in several hundred or 1,000 or more of these USVs. They're cheap. They're small. They're hard to detect. There's no metallic components. They're easily programmed to either home on jamming or simply stay still until the coast is clear. Like I say, you can't detect them with sonar or any metallic detecting sensor. And the Taiwanese could use hundreds of these to stop any Chinese attack. The Chinese would run into basically a buzzsaw. These things are silent. They're only about less than a meter above the surface. In fact, less than that. Some of the Ukrainian ones are underwater. I mean, they just have a little mast sticking up, to keep an eye on things and for communications and navigation. There's no counter for that. The Chinese aren't mentioning it because they realize that they're screwed. There's no way to stop it. If then they can move on Taiwan, they're going to be sunk by a bunch of robots. Never mind the mines. I mean, the mines have had their day, but they've been replaced by these USVs, which, like I say, are mobile and controllable. And like I say, if you jam them, the Ukrainians have already done this. You reprogram to either home on jamming or simply sit still until they reestablish communications. Or after, there's a lot of things you could do with these programmable USVs. If nothing happens for a while, just turn around and come home. We've been doing that with UAVs for decades. If you lose your contact with the operator and there's no other option, just turn around and go home. The Chinese are not talking about this because there's nothing they can do about it, and they'd rather not discuss hopeless situations. It's not just a Chinese habit. I think everybody thinks that way. The Russians are basically taking a terrific beating in Ukraine. They don't hear much about that anymore. They're running out of troops. They're running out of munitions. Remember, they have no allies. China will sell them things, but they expect to be paid. North Koreans did the same thing. The Ukrainians have basically identified, by going through the debris of ballistic missiles recently fired at Ukrainian targets, that it's definitely North Korean. What the Ukrainians need, and hopefully you're going to get, are more F-16s and more anti-missile missiles. Basically, Patriots, and there's a European missile, the Iris-T, that will take care of some of the missiles. But the penultimate anti-missile missile is the Patriot. The problem is every ally, every NATO country has sent practically all of their Patriot missiles to Ukraine. And the production has increased. The annual production is up to over 600, nearly 700 a year. It's not enough. But given enough Patriot missiles, the Ukrainians can stop anything the Russians can throw at them. And the Russians, again, are running out of things to throw at Ukraine. They're still producing these missiles, but they cannot produce as many of these missiles as the Ukrainians can obtain Patriot missiles to stop them. So there's a lot less damage. The Iranians have been supplying these slow flying Shahed cruise missiles, and they're basically target practice. The Ukrainians have set up a machine gun system. It's a system of machine guns connected with a central fire control center, and they basically, it's target practice time. Some get through, but very few. You can make a lot of noise, but 3 of them got through. Yeah, but they sent out 300. So victory goes to the side that is basically more desperate and basically playing defense. The Russians aren't playing defense, and they're paying the price. The sanctions are killing them. Like I say, the Chinese only help if you can afford to pay, and more of the Russians can't afford to pay. And we have some leverage with the Russians because we can ease up, as we have a couple of times, on their on our program to block their oil exports. We tell them, look, stop doing this, and we'll have more of your oil through. They're selling it at a big discount. And now they're basically understandably worried about the Ukrainians. The NATO will not let the Ukrainians use their long-range weapons like ATACMS. We send them inside, deep inside Russia. But the Ukrainians have built their own UAVs, and they have basically demolished a lot of the fuel storage depots and refineries as far north as St. Petersburg. The Russians in Moscow have seen the explosions on the outskirts, and they're wondering what happened to our air defenses. There used to be S-300 and S-400, which S-400 is just an improved S-300 with a new name, outside Moscow. All of those have been sent out to the Ukrainian border, so they can basically protect their troops against, Ukrainian missiles. Ukraine has allies, lots of them, and Russia has none, and that's beginning to show the signs. I mean, the Russians are running out of soldiers. India got on their case. They hired a lot of Indians, a lot of unemployed Indians. Some of them got killed. They were just in support jobs, but they were in a combat zone. And, several thousand of those have since been withdrawn back to India because India does not, hire out mercenaries to Russia or anybody else. And if you're sending non-combat support troops, Indians, into Russia, you're in a combat zone, some are going to get killed, and that's exactly what happened. So Russia is in a big, catastrophe. They have no allies. They're running out of resources. They're running out of money. The sanctions are basically cutting back on their oil exports. They started the war in Ukraine, and they've been talking about finishing it. But what they're arguing over now is whether or not they can keep the Ukrainian territory they've already occupied. They occupy 27% of Ukraine. The Ukrainians are saying, no deal. The Ukrainians realize that they haven't taken all these losses in this, defeating this Russian invasion just to say, okay, you can keep your terrain, we'll stop fighting. No. And Putin realizes he's going to be out of a job if he not only withdraws from Ukraine, but also gives up Crimea and those portions of the Donetsk and Luhansk provinces in eastern Ukraine, and basically Ukraine is whole again. That is by no, way of explanation a victory for Russia. And Putin wants to have a victory where he can say, well, we still got the stuff we stole from them back in 2014 and more recently. The Ukrainians aren't going to allow that to happen. So the good guys are winning for a change because the bad guys are running out of ammunition. They have no allies, and China is not willing to get into a war with anybody. The Chinese have always been like that. They'll huff and they'll puff, but they won't fight because they know better. The Russians don't.
Well, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you, gentlemen, and we'll talk to you next time.
Take care, guys. That was fun.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Guys, that